Okay. All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
Jihi Vakarja, welcome to Trasna Natira. Celebrated in ballad and described as a provider of mysteries within a mystery, the saga of the Thompson submachine gun and its part in the Irish War of Independence holds a prominent place in the lore and legend of the Revolutionary era. Despite its prominence, however, the Thompson gun only arrived in Ireland shortly before the climax of the war. Its role in action was a minor one, and it was discharged in combat on only 3 accounts with little effect. Since the pioneering 1967 article by Bowyer Bell, much has been written concerning the procurement and attempted importation of Thompson guns to Ireland, although an insufficient amount has been written concerning their use during the war. The riddle of the events which led to the gun's importation, owing no doubt to its extraordinary story, has overshadowed and sidelined a detailed account of the gun's actual use during the war. So Trasna Natira welcomes back Aaron Maonaigh, who will recount the story of the Thompson submachine gun and the Irish War of Independence. So over to you, Aaron.
Míle buíochas column agus fáilte rómh arás got dinner and ucht. You're all very welcome to this talk this evening, and it's a great pleasure to be back again speaking to Trasna Natira. And thanks to Liam and Colm and everybody involved for having me back on here again. Tonight I'll be speaking to you about the Thompson submachine gun during the War of Independence, and this presentation is based on my BA thesis that I wrote back when I was doing my undergrad in Coláiste Fóric, and more recently has been published in the most recent copy of the Irish Sword Journal, that is the Journal of the Military History Society of Ireland, in its winter 2021 edition. What I'll do is I'll share a small PowerPoint here, which I'll speak over. Apologies for the lack of images. I did have a more comprehensive PowerPoint, but unfortunately, along with the USB that I most recently lost, that PowerPoint was something that went along with that. But nevertheless, I have a couple of images here, and most importantly, perhaps a timeline of events here, which should help to kind of illustrate things for people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and if there's any issues with seeing it, Colm or Liam, if you could just give me a bell and let me know what the crack is. Oh, here we go. So this image here which you see up the top is Dan Hogan, and it's taken outside of a house in County Monaghan, a big house during the truce period, and the thing that's like it's an amazing photograph in itself, you know, because here is the Irish volunteer sitting proudly outside the big house, which for many revolutionaries would have been the bastion of I suppose British imperialism in Ireland in many ways. And here he is sitting proudly with a Thompson submachine gun over his lap. But the very fact that this picture was taken during the truce period, you know, speaks a lot about the Thompson gun and its role, or you know, limited role during the War of Independence. That a lot of our photographs, if not all of them, date from the period of the truce onwards into the Civil War, and that's something that I'm going to speak about a bit more throughout the presentation. But as Colm mentioned in the introduction, the Thompson submachine gun, you know, it holds a sort of hollow place within the mythology of the Irish War of Independence. It's celebrated in the famous ballad. And it's often been described as a provider of mysteries within a mystery. Owing, no doubt, as Colm mentioned, to the kind of circumstances and how it came to be in Ireland in the very first place. Yet, despite this legend that's been built up around the Thompson submachine gun, its part, as I've mentioned, was actually rather, you know, it was something of a damn squib, to put it kind of politely. in that it was only discharged on 3 occasions during the War of Independence in total, although it was present at several more operations. The gun itself was introduced into Ireland roughly around April 1921. There was a shipment which arrived into Cork, something that historians have disputed for some years, but something that we can now say, concretely that they did arrive in Cork in April of 1921. Why they weren't used is a real riddle, or rather real mystery. They were snuck in on a consignment of furniture which travelled from New York to Cove in County Cork, and this shipment is confirmed among many other sources in the Florrie O'Donoghue papers in the National Library. Why they weren't used now is another thing. But the gun itself, there were great expectations among GHQ, that is the general headquarters of the IRA, that this gun was going to shake up the war, proverbially speaking. It was ushered into combat by the Dublin Brigades in the aftermath of the Customs House operation on the 25th of May 1921. And it was seen as a key instrument in escalating the campaign against the British Crown forces in the capital. It was a more than welcome addition to the IRA's arsenal, which, by and large consisted of a medley of mismatched, often dated weapons and whatever arms that could be attained through raids on police stations and barracks, and those which were sequestered after ambushes. The arrival of the gun, it was hoped, would remove the necessity of transferring weapons between units for large-scale operations, particularly amongst the 4 Dublin battalions, notwithstanding the 5th Engineering Dublin Battalion. In a memo concerning the capabilities and proposed allocation of the new gun, Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff, stressed that the offensive power that the Thompson gun would bring to IRA units in hard-pressed areas, particularly when mounting attacks on large enemy targets. And what we've come to see when the Thompson submachine gun was employed during the War of Independence was that each of the incidents in which it was used or intended for use during the war involved a relatively small body of IRA men intent on engaging a large body of British troops. And this marked a distinct departure from the Dublin Brigade's usual operations, which, were smaller attacks, often assassination style. As the war was reaching its climax, the Dublin Brigade was carrying out operations on a much greater scale and planning several more. The Customs House operation of the 25th of May proved costly for the IRA, particularly for the Dublin Brigade's 2nd Battalion, whose numbers were almost halved by the capture of some 70 volunteers in the aftermath of the engagement, in addition to 7 killed and at least 12 wounded. In response to this setback, the squad and the active service unit were amalgamated to form one single unitary force, the Dublin Guard, under the command of Paddy O'Daly. And it was this newly formed force which played a significant part in the final weeks of the war in Dublin. 2 shipments of the Thompson gun could be verified as having reached Ireland before the truce, and a 3rd landed in Cork in April 1921. This is the aforementioned Cork arrival, which preceded them. The first of the verifiable shipments contained 3 Thompson guns, which were smuggled into Ireland by 2 Irish-born ex-US Army officers, Lieutenant Patrick Cronin and Major James J. Deneen. On the 24th of May 1921, the day before the Customs House operation, both officers gave a demonstration of the gun's use on the grounds of the Christian Brothers at Marino, Dublin. Present at the demonstration were Michael Collins, Gerald O'Sullivan, Richard Mulcahy, Paddy O'Daly and Tom Barry, as well as several other members of IRA GHQ. Tom Barry was given the honour of test firing the weapon. It had been intended that Deneen and Cronin would train several prominent officers of the various battalions, who then themselves would in turn set up training camps on the gun's use around the country. Oscar Traynor, however, stated that at the time of the gun's arrival, it wasn't practical to give demonstrations of the Thompson gun's shooting prowess, with the exception of the demonstration at Marino. Thus, the Dublin Brigade's experience of the gun consisted mainly of lectures, which were held at the plaza, demonstrating its various parts and mechanisms and how to take the gun asunder. This lack of practical demonstration would prove costly for the IRA, which they would discover some weeks later at the second of two Drumcondra ambushes involving the gun. And just coming back to shipments there was a second consignment of 51 Thompson guns, which were purchased by a John J. Murphy on behalf of Mr. P.J. Gentry, which were shipped independently of the main shipment of Thompson guns on the east side batch. And they arrived via Liverpool only days before the truce. They were consequently not used in combat against any British forces. There was a major shipment of up to 600 Thompson submachine guns, which were bound for Ireland on board a ship that was harboured in Hoboken in New York. But unfortunately for the IRA, that ship was discovered. And as you can see from the New York Times report here, the gun was discovered by a curious strikebreaker who was inspecting the ship, and his curiosity led him to cut one of the sacks that contained the guns and exposed the guns for what they were, and not the legs of lamb which they professed to be. So this major shipment of Thompson submachine guns bound for Ireland, would have undoubtedly had a massive impact on the war. But unfortunately for the IRA, they were discovered while still in port, and they were taken into custody by the authorities. They were later smuggled back to Ireland. Some allege, and Liam, you might know more about this than me, some of them allegedly by a visiting Kerry football team later on in the 1920s. The rest of them were sort of smuggled back piecemeal through various channels. But returning, I suppose, to the story of the gun and its part in the War of Independence, all of the instances in which a Thompson gun was used or intended for use during the war followed a distinct pattern of attack. In each case, the target was a train carrying British troops, which the IRA attempted to slow down or derail, at which point heavy bombardment and gunfire would be opened upon the target. With the exception of one ambush in the Salvage area on the 2nd of July 1921, all of the instances in which a Thompson gun was used were strictly confined to Dublin City and its suburbs. The first operation where a Thompson gun was utilised during the War of Independence occurred on the 14th of June 1921, when the Dublin Brigade Active Service Unit, in conjunction with members of the 5th Battalion Engineering, attempted to derail a troop train travelling from the North Wall to Newbridge, County Kildare, via the Great Southern and Western Railway loop line at Drumcondra Station. This is the earliest recorded mention of the presence of a Thompson gun at an IRA operation. The first Drumcondra ambush served as a template for future ambushes, whereby the individual sections of the Active Service Unit would work in tandem on operations which GHQ deemed significant. On the 14th of June, shortly before noon, Lieutenant William J. Stapleton and another unnamed member of the squad commandeered a house facing the railway embankment at Drumcondra, from where they trained the Thompson gun sights on the railway in anticipation of the expected troop train. The men of the engineering department had removed and discarded some 50 yards of rail on the St. Anne's roadside with intention of sending the train crashing into the permanent way. This operation, however, would prove to be unsuccessful because the goods train was sent out ahead of the troop train and was derailed, damaging the engine on one of the carriages. A signalman further down the line had witnessed the event and sent word back to the North Wall, alerting authorities to the presence of the IRA. No shots were fired from the Thompson gun nor were any other weapons engaged during this operation. The IRA men quickly dispersed once they realised that they derailed their own train. The first time that a Thompson gun would actually be brought into action during the war was shortly thereafter, on the 16th of June 1921, coincidentally the same day in which the shipment of Thompson submachine guns sitting in the harbour in New York was discovered. Drumcondra was once again chosen as the point of attack. A 12-strong IRA unit assembled on the morning of the attack, and it comprised of men from the squad and the active service unit, and consisted of 2 Thompson machine gunners, 8 bombers, a driver, and an OC. The bombers took up positions on both sides of the railway line, covering a distance of approximately 150 yards. Charlie Dalton and Stapleton, who were responsible for manning the Thompson machine guns, took up position in a laneway adjacent to St. Columba's Road, which overlooked the railway. Stapleton and Dalton used a motor car to transport the Thompson guns to the ambush site, where they were kept concealed up until they were brought into action. And this was a selling point of the Thompson submachine gun, particularly regarding guerrilla warfare, that it had a removable stock and it could be concealed underneath a coat with great ease. And this was obviously of huge benefit to the IRA, particularly those working in large urban areas, that they could dismantle the gun, hide it away, and move back among the crowds as a civilian. The high walls on both sides of the railway line at Drumcondra offered Dalton's men the double advantage of height and cover. At 8:30 that morning, a troop train left Amiens Street Station, conveying a party of around 300 men from the West Kent Regiment. The train was no more than 5 minutes into its journey when heavy bombardment was opened up from the volunteers on the embankments, who had hurled grenades at the approaching train, one of which exploded directly under a carriage. Stapleton managed to fire off 50 or 60 rounds from the Thompson before a stoppage in the gun's chamber brought the Thompson gun's debut to a halt. Dalton failed to bring his gun into action due to what he later termed an unfamiliarity with its mechanisms. Despite being racked with bombardment from the men who lined the embankments, the train carried on to its destination at Kingsbridge, now Euston Station. The front van and 3 of the carriages were badly perforated with bullets. Splinters of woodwork, bullets, and broken glass lined the floors of others. That morning, the West Kent suffered 4 casualties, 3 dead and 1 severely injured. Following the ambush, the Thompson submachine guns were later transported back to the squad's Abbey Street arms dump at Moorlands. And the incident, or what occurred at Drumcondra, particularly with the jamming of the gun and Dalton's unfamiliarity with its use, these are things we see again and again with the deployment of the gun in the War of Independence, and they all come back to, I suppose, one sort of mechanical failing of the gun, in that it used 2 types of clips. One was a round, perhaps the more famous of the 2. One was a round, sort of disc-shaped magazine or clip, which would rotate around into the gun and had a propensity for jamming. And the other, I suppose, setback that we experienced here was that Dalton, hadn't gotten much instruction, if any, on the use of the gun. And I presume tried to sort of employ the techniques that you would use with other machine guns that were prevalent during the period, to little avail, owing, I suppose, to the differences between the use of the Thompson submachine gun and others. And I suppose that's kind of key in the success, or rather lack thereof, of the Thompson submachine gun and its deployment during the War of Independence. That this great unfamiliarity with it, owing to the lack of proper training around it, actually hindered the gun's deployment. And this is sort of evident in its next appearance, where it was even less successful than it had been during the attack in Drumcondra on the 16th of June. And it passed off without a shot being fired, at least from a Thompson gun anyway. But unlike Drumcondra, I suppose, it was not due to any mechanical failure or volunteers' lack of familiarity, but rather of the over-eagerness of one of the ambush party. On the day, on the morning of the 24th of June 1921, the IRA attempted to mine a troop train which was scheduled to travel from Belfast to Dublin via the Great Northern Railway. On the previous night, 6 30-pound mines were placed on the GNR line, approximately 100 yards away from the railway station in Colester. A half company of men under Joe Leonard took up a position at the road bridge past the station signal box, whilst O'Daly's 20-strong group of men armed with revolvers and hand grenades lined the embankments on both sides for a stretch of some 200 to 300 yards. William Stapleton again arrived with a Thompson gun and was positioned on a small footbridge spanning the railway tracks. In tactics which would later be used with greater efficiency at the Ballyfermot ambush, Colonel Pádraig O'Crahor and his half company of men, armed with several half-pint bottles of petrol and a single 5-gallon tin of the same, were placed in a position upon the road bridge which crossed the railway tracks. O'Crahor's men were instructed to launch their flammables at the train and ensure that the vehicle was set alight. O'Daly had warned his men that the passenger train from Holt would possibly arrive before the expected troop train, and that this vehicle was not to be engaged. However, when the Holt train arrived as expected, one of O'Daly's men, disobeying his order to hold fire, prematurely fired his grenade at the carriages. O'Daly's party stayed in position for approximately half an hour, but fearing that cover was blown and wary of an impending military response, O'Daly ordered his men to retreat. There were no casualties, but upon arriving at Amiens Street Station, it was discovered that 2 of the Holt train carriages had been badly damaged. The troop train subsequently passed along the line unmolested. Later that evening, at roughly 7:30 p.m, a military train transferring troops from Kingsbridge to the Curragh was sniped by men between Inchicore and Clondalkin. Several windows were broken, but there were no casualties. The volunteer who prematurely launched his grenade at Colester was summoned to GHQ following the aborted attack and was court-martialed and transferred to another unit as a result. It afterwards emerged that the trigger-happy pair were not members of the active service unit, but had only allegedly been brought along to bolster the numbers. Vinnie Bourne of the squad recalled in his witness statement that 2 Thompson submachine guns, along with several revolvers and hand grenades, were transported to Colester Lane using Bob Holland's pony and trap. There, on an occasion which he states was prior to the Colester ambush, the 24th of June, a large body of volunteers had gathered to ambush a troop train. Bourne recounted that after a passenger train had passed the ambush position, the volunteers called off the operation and handed back their weapons without firing a single shot. Events, however, at Colester were to be rather overshadowed by the successful derailment of a troop train near Atavoyle on the border of counties Armagh and Louth during an attack carried out by the Mullabon company of the Armagh IRA. The train was carrying 113 men of the 10th Royal Hussars, along with 104 horses, which had been part of the Royal Escort for the British King's trip to Belfast to open the Northern Parliament. The site of the attack was some 10 miles north of Dundalk. A mine was placed on the tracks and it was detonated, sending 14 carriages tumbling down the 30-foot embankments. 5 soldiers, 1 civilian guard, and approximately 40 horses died as a result of the ambush, and several machine guns and rifles were destroyed by the IRA. The Dublin Brigade IRA continued to target trains carrying military personnel, and at each major engagement involving the railway, a Thompson submachine gun was present. An elaborate attempt to blow up a troop train on the Great Southern and Western Line between Hazelhatch and Selbridge on the 2nd of July was only thwarted when a military patrol of the South Lancashire Regiment sighted a number of IRA men in the vicinity of the railway line. The operation was undertaken by a large body of men comprised of the 1st, 2nd and Fingal battalions of the Dublin Brigade, and had a company of men from North Kildare, supplemented by Jimmy McGuinness of the Active Service Unit, and these men were armed with Thompson submachine guns. The engineering battalion had laid 8 mines at various points along the railway with the intent of derailing the troop train. The rest of the men lined the embankments with revolvers, bombs, and rifles. As they were aware of an IRA presence in the area, the South Lancashires called the pilot engine which preceded the troop train to halt at Lucan and gave orders for it to remain there until the arrival of the 4th Troop Special. The troops proceeded in a lorry to the spot where the IRA men had been spotted, but the ambush party, having been alerted that the military had caught wind of their attack, have retreated from their positions. During the IRA's retreat, Jimmy McGuinness fired a burst from his Thompson gun into the air from a position to the left of the military party, which caused them to believe that they were under attack, from an IRA party at their rear. And this action by McGuinness allowed for the IRA to retreat successfully and unscathed. Seamus Finn recalled that following the ambush, the OC Padraig Maonaigh of the North Kildare column asked McGuinness if he would lend him the Thompson submachine gun, to which McGuinness stated he assented to after much coaxing. Later that evening, Maonaigh and the volunteers of the Leixlip Company conducted a diversionary attack upon the RIC barracks in Lucan. The penultimate appearance of the Thompson submachine gun during the War of Independence was also the last time that the gun was fired in combat. And this occurred on the 8th of July, 1921, just 3 days before the truce between the British and Irish forces, which brought to an end the War of Independence. And it was during an attack, again on a train running on the Great Southern and Western Railway line in my native Ballyfermot. The operation was launched by members of the 3rd and 4th sections of the ASU, working in conjunction with the local company, F Company of the 4th Battalion. Information had been received by a friendly woman in the station and passed on to volunteer Michael O'Neill that British troops would be travelling by train from the station to the Curragh. Working on this information, the volunteers learned that the troops intended to board the train on the 1:15 Dublin to Cork passenger train. Pádraig O'Crahor, the local captain, set about making plans to ambush the troop train at Ballyfermot Bridge, approximately midway between the stations of Kingsbridge and Clondalkin. Considerable organisation went into the planning of the ambush at Ballyfermot, as the ASU were determined to make up for the unsuccessful attack on the troop train at Drumcondra 3 weeks previously, and also to show that the Dublin Brigade were able to operate unhindered following the Customs House arrests. On the day of the operation, O'Crahor's half company of volunteers assembled off Cork Street and cycled the distance to the ambush site, whereupon they were met by the active service unit and squad members Pat McRae and Jimmy McGuinness. McRae and McGuinness, to whom Oscar Traynor had communicated details of the ambush, brought the Thompson gun, travelling to the site in an old armour-plated military lorry nicknamed the Green Lizzie, which they camouflaged as a delivery van. The van had been acquired from Crown Forces at an earlier stage in the war. O'Crahor's plan for the Ballyfermot ambush was to have the members of the half company, similar to the attacks in Killester and Drumcondra, line the embankments 20 yards from the bridge on both sides. Several men armed with grenades would be placed further up the line on the Kildare side. Above and concealed by the bridge's parapets, several volunteers awaited the train's arrival with 2 5-gallon canisters of petrol. Behind them and facing in the opposite direction were several men, including Joe McGuinness and Pádraig O'Crahor, and those were in possession of old sacks which they doused in paraffin oil and petrol for the purpose of setting fire to the carriages. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, as per the information received, a party of roughly 70 Gordon Highlanders boarded the train at Kingsbridge and distributed themselves amongst the passengers and throughout the coaches. In addition to the passengers and troops, some horse boxes containing animals returning from the Bellewstown races in Meath were also attached to the locomotive, as well as several wagons containing stores and other military equipment. Arrangements were made to have a motorcyclist stationed at Kingsbridge travel to Ballyfermot in order to notify the ambush party as to the portions of the train which were being occupied by the military. However, this plan never came to fruition. As the train approached Ballyfermot, a scout placed on a timber pass bridge gave the signal to the volunteers that the train was arriving and that it did indeed contain British troops. When it reached the bridge, the volunteers positioned above arose from behind the parapet and poured the contents of the canisters on the roof of the wagons. As the train passed under the bridge, the volunteers on the embankment opened up with heavy revolver fire on the opposite side. Joe McGuinness and Pádraig Ó Cruthaoir lit and threw down the burning sacks, setting the tops of the carriages alight. Bombs were thrown by men on the Kildare side of the bridge, and Jimmy McGuinness, opened up with a Thompson submachine gun upon the carriages. The train slowed down as it passed under the bridge because the volunteers had greased the track, but it was not brought to a halt and continued upon its journey towards Gundalkin. Some of the troops on the train returned fire by leaning out the windows, but as the train didn't stop, the engagement, like the previous engagements, had been all too brief. The IRA and the military suffered no casualties, but several civilian passengers were injured by bullets, fragments, bombs, and broken glass. One of them, John Rossiter, a native of Red Cross, County Wicklow, was wounded during the attack. Rossiter was conveyed by an pilot engine, to Gundalkin, back to Kingsbridge, where he was removed to Dr. Stevens Hospital. Unfortunately for Rossiter, he died later that day from a combination of his wounds and shock. He'd lost a leg in the initial ambush and had his other leg amputated upon arrival at Stevens Hospital. Following the attack, the Thompson submachine guns, similar to the operations at Drumcondra and Killester, were returned to Moorlands on Abbey Street. Earlier that day, the IRA had attempted to blow up a special train crossing the River Maig in County Limerick, but this, however, was aborted when a party of Royal Welsh Fusiliers surprised the attackers. The Ballyfermot ambush would be the last engagement before the truce by the numbers 3 and 4 sections of the Dublin Brigade's ASU. The gun's last appearance was on the final day of the war, when a particularly large offensive involving parties from all 4 fighting battalions of the Dublin Brigade was due to converge on Grafton Street with the intention of wiping out all parties of auxiliaries and British military that were present on the street. Once again, the men in possession of the Thompson submachine guns were Charlie Dalton and Bill Stapleton, who were travelling by Maonaigh car. This operation, however, was called off at the last minute because of the impending truce. The advent of the truce put paid to plans for further IRA activity, including an ambitious ambush involving the use of 2 large landmines and the active service union's Thompson guns that Pádraig Ó Cruthaoir had planned for Crumlin Cross in the aftermath of the Ballyfermot ambush. The sort of aim of this talk has rather been to identify the engagements in which the Thompson gun was involved in the War of Independence and hopefully add another piece to the jigsaw of the period that we come to call the Irish Revolution. The 6 operations which I spoke about this evening are by no means a definitive list for, as we've seen, as time passes and as new sources become available, information about the Thompson gun may appear to change those. Contrary to a popular belief, the gun's role in the War of Independence was a supplementary one and not the revolutionary one that GHQ had expected upon its arrival. By July 1921, the IRA had made significant gains in the production of homemade incendiaries. By this stage, the IRA's arm manufacturers had perfected the production of a 3-second fuse hand grenade, and experiments with the production of trench mortars and mines were making ground, notwithstanding some disastrous setbacks. As Pádraig Ó Cruthaoir later remarked to Ernie O'Malley, the squad was not short of grenades. Interfering with the railway too provided the IRA with many an activity, from mail raids and signal cabinet destruction to sniping and derailments. But this study shows that there was close cooperation between the Dublin Brigade's Engineering Battalion and the Active Service Unit, which is evidence of the evolutionary nature of the IRA's guerrilla campaign and of its ability to adjust itself to British counterinsurgency methods. Progress in the area of munitions wasn't lost on IRA GHQ, nor on the officers in the field. And it's clear from the operations mentioned that the IRA were more than keen to use these to their strength. Just to put things into perspective regarding the operations which occurred around this period, those involving the Thompson gun and those that didn't, the mine that derailed the troop train at Atavoyle inflicted more casualties than the combined sum of all 6 Dublin Brigade operations where a Thompson gun was utilised. In the latter months of the war, the IRA played to their strengths, which were in the lucrative areas of railway raids and munition productions. It is no coincidence that the frequency with which mines and other incendiaries were used at this period coincided with a spike in railway attacks. In the closing months of the war, the Great Southern and Western Railway line alone was targeted 182 times in June and 72 times in the first 12 days of July. In the wider context of the war, the casualties conceded in the final year of the conflict amounted to some 60% of the total casualties for the entire wartime period, suggesting that an upsurge in operations in Dublin was part of a wider escalation in hostilities across the island. Insofar as the Thompson submachine gun performance during the war is concerned, the failure to hold practical demonstrations proved costly at the second of the two Drumcondra ambushes. Some years later, discussing the Drumcondra ambush in his memoir, Charlie Dalton was quite frank about the reasons why he failed to fire a single shot at Drumcondra. The reason he gave was his unfamiliarity with the mechanisms of the Thompson gun. Interestingly, Dalton recalled that he'd received a lecture on the Thompson gun before the ambush, but stated that it was purely theoretic rather than practical, and that the guns were kept carefully hidden when they were brought in until they were brought into action. Dalton went on to further state that he'd neither seen the gun in action nor had he received any instruction on the handling of load or the loading of it. In fact, with the exception of those present at the Marino incident, most of the volunteers involved in operations in which a Tommy gun was present between June and July 1921 stated that they hadn't been given any practical demonstration on its use. This would account for the employment of Jimmy McGuinness and Bill Stapleton and Dalton in the ambushes involving the Thompson gun, that they were the only ones who had any familiarity with it, and even at that, it was little to none. The Thompson gun represented a major investment for the IRA at a crucial junction during the war, and IRA GHQ were expecting great returns on its investment. The arrival of the major shipment of Thompson submachine guns was deemed by IRA as GHQ as a solution to the problem of weapon shortages faced by many brigades and units across the country. The trickle that did arrive, however, didn't allow for these hopes to be fulfilled. Cork brigades made regular appeals to GHQ for a replenishment of arms, as did those in County Mayo. A captured document established that the majority of the east side shipment was actually destined for beleaguered sections, beleaguered sections in areas of heavy fighting such as Dublin, the Cork number 1 and the Cork number 3 brigades. The discovery of the east side, however, shattered hopes for a countrywide dispersal of the guns as proposed by GHQ. And with a single exception, the neighbouring county of Kildare was the only place outside Dublin where an operation where a Thompson gun was used took place. Owing to the precariousness and difficulty of conducting further demonstrations at training camps at this stage in the war, and to the added risk that such endeavours posed should the guns be discovered, the IRA seemed to be content with a rather trial and error approach, preferring to try out the gun in the field and assess its capabilities and viability as a weapon for use in guerrilla warfare afterwards. While securing a deal for landing several hundred of the latest type of machine gun was a major coup for the IRA, a series of unfortunate setbacks compounded by a rather tame performance in action detracted from the expected glory of the Thompson gun's arrival. A renewed recitation of the hopes for the Thompson submachine gun was expressed by Richard Mulcahy and appeared in the pages of An Tóglacht only 10 days after the advent of the truce. Little did its authors know, however, that those guns would be turned against them in the ensuing civil war. Ach, Shinné on scale Ella. That's it from me. If anyone has any questions, we can open the floor there, or Colin, if you wish.
Yeah, that was a Excellent talk, Aaron. Let's just going to look at the questions here now. So, right, the first one here from Liam Shortle. Where did the funds, for example, for those 105 seized guns come from? Was it a fundraising in the US or sympathetic gun dealers?
Well, through the usual channels, through the IRB, you know, and Clonmacnoise over in the States, there was a lot of kind of behind the scene things going on. Harry Boland travelled over with a large sum of money, as did one of the Gifford or Gifford, I think it should be pronounced, sisters. And through those networks, that money was raised, as well as money from I suppose the Ministry of Defence of the Doyle funds were channeled to America, and then through contacts within the IRB and those within the actual company then that made the weapon, the guns were then transported over. But you know, the story, I suppose, of even securing the deal itself is a phenomenal one, and anyone interested, I suppose, in that should definitely look towards Peter Hart's article on the Thompson submachine gun, and also Patrick Young's article. Both of those were published in the Irish Sword, the same journal that my own was, and they cover that a lot more than I do. But yeah, to answer it in short, money raised here and in America, channeled through the usual networks within the States, the IRB and Clonmacnoise, and the aim was to import them on a large scale. But unfortunately, the 650 odd guns that were aboard the ship in New York in June of 1921 were discovered. So the only ones that made it into the country had just kind of been snuck in on other ships, and in a much smaller quantity.
Okay. We have from Timothy Hoyt. There's an old story that Harry Boland and the IRB made the first order for the Thompsons, basically started in the production line. Is that correct, or was the production line already hot for other purposes such as the US Army, law enforcement, or private sales?
That's a great question. There are actually photographs existing. I think it's the NYPD firing the guns, and they declined the offer to buy them wholesale, you know, and employ them within that force. The Brits were also sniffing around. There's correspondence between you know, the various branches, I suppose, of British military, and that inquiring as to the guns, and also as to whether the IRA have them themselves. The serial numbers themselves, there is a website. There's a website on the Thompson submachine gun that has kind of tracked several ones that we now have, I suppose, in our possession, including the ones in Kilmainham jail and that were previously in Enniscorthy Castle. And Patrick Young's article deals with that in greater detail than my own. But the IRA were the first large-scale purchasers of it. Yeah, to put it, I suppose, bluntly, the IRA were, yeah.
Okay. So Jude Steins, the common images available of the Thompson in IRA usage seems to be the 100 round drum magazines, exceptionally rare even then. So David Flood, submachine guns are definitely tricky to fire off, especially in comparison to heavier ones, which are stabilized with bipods or tripods. Someone holding a firing weapon and firing continuously will nearly immediately start to fire high. Soldiers are trained to fire submachine guns from the hip in very short bursts. In 1921, untrained volunteers can't be blamed for not knowing this. Wait 1 second. How much ammunition was acquired with the Thompsons? Robert Mosher is asking that one.
How much ammunition? I think they came in 100 and perhaps 150, if not 200 round drums. because the rate of fire was extremely rapid in them. And like as David was saying there in the comments, the guns do pull, you know, and I'd say this was something that the IRA experienced in those operations, that you know, the guns were meant for, they were nicknamed the trench broom, because they were for sweeping or clearing out trenches during the First World War. But unfortunately, you know, for the producer, they basically didn't get them off the production line, and the war stopped too soon for them anyway, to be employed in that. So they would have dragged. And I do take David's point there that untrained volunteers, you know, weren't to know that the gun had a propensity to jam, or that it had a propensity to pull, you know, when you were firing it, particularly on automatic or the semi-automatic functions or whatever. But again, that lies with IRA GHQ, not having physical demonstrations on it. I mean, I understand the context in which they, you know, and the reasons why they didn't have one, but it was inevitable that sending men out there into the field with a brand spanking new weapon, and expecting everything to be gravy is probably wishful thinking, you know. Cheers, Des. I just saw that comment there regarding the number of rounds in the drums. It's been several years since I've held a Thompson submachine gun myself. Probably going back to that picture I sent you earlier on, Colin, which would have been around, Jesus.
Yeah.
Last Fallon will give you a date on that. Maybe 2017, I think. But yeah, sorry, I've gone full circle here on that. I've forgotten what the exact question was. Apologies, Colin. It was the number of rounds.
Yeah, no, I think
yeah. Beat it there, yeah.
From Pat Murphy, was the Thompson used by the Free State forces in the Civil War? I know we're going off the period, but let's say some people might be curious.
Yeah,
so
that's fine.
We can just round it off.
They were indeed, yeah, they were indeed, and a lot of our pictures, you know, date from that period as well. Like there's pictures, I suppose, of the fighting in Dublin, and Thompson submachine guns present, and they were present in a much greater number during the Civil War than they were during the War of Independence, obviously, and during the truce. And there's a lot more mention of them. The anti-treaty IRA, I think Todd Andrews said that the first thing he saw when he got out of prison, he was picked up in a car, and there was 2 Thompson submachine guns in the back of it, and they were deployed by the IRA, yeah, and the Free State Army, I suppose, in almost equal number, I suppose, to whomever had them. But yeah, you used to much greater effect as well, I suppose, during the War of Independence. And the IRA seemed to have a significant number of them, because they got in a shipment during the truce period via Liverpool, I think, of 50 odd Thompson submachine guns, and they obviously then went to the IRA, as it were, then, and I'd imagine, like anything, when the split occurred, people took for themselves what they thought was theirs.
Yeah. Richard Barnes just as an input here, he says supply of .45 caliber ammunition was certainly a problem. I read that during British raids between March and June 1921, 16,388 rounds of .45 ammunition was recovered. In some cases, IRA factories in Dublin were put to work at the risky task of converting .303 rifle ammunition into .45 revolver bullets. From Jerry Shannon, very enlightening talk, great stuff. Liam Shortle, Maonaigh Aaron, John Dorney, great stuff, Aaron, much appreciated. Patrick Kilfeather, in terms of the propaganda benefit, is there any record of the response or assessment of the British intelligence to this new threat?
Well, they were sussing it out, and they did put out the feelers to see had the IRA got them. Like the IRA actually suspected that the Brits and the Yankees had kind of somehow cooperated in the seizure, which occurred in Hoboken in June that was the massive shipment of Thompson submachine guns, which didn't make it to Ireland until much later. You know, they'd actually thought that something had occurred, that maybe British intelligence had picked up on it, and between them and the Americans had conspired to basically to capture the shipment. But that wasn't the case at all. You know, the Brits were genuinely putting the feelers out, hadn't any concrete information, were quite simply searching for information as to what the IRA's position was, whether they had them, whether they were trying to import them, and what exactly was going on. So, you know, it also kind of, because of how late it is in the war, you know, like it's introduced in the middle of June. The war is over within a month, so there isn't that much time, I suppose, to gather intelligence on them. And there's also, I think, the IRA were quite cute in how they used them, in that it was the same 2 Thompson submachine guns used at every operation. Yet, because they were present at multiple operations, different periods around the county, it gave the appearance that there was much more than there actually were. You know, and in some way that kind of fooled all, I suppose, into believing that there were more of them. You know, which obviously was great from a propaganda view, or propaganda perspective for the IRA. But short answer, no. The British did put out some feelers regarding intelligence as to how many, if any, the IRA had. Yet they had nothing concrete. And I'm sure that the soldiers, the very first group of soldiers that were attacked on the 16th of June, hadn't kind of a Scooby-Doo what was going on, you know, when the gun was opened up on them. And they, you know, they probably would have had no reason for presuming it was anything other than any of the other machine guns which were deployed during that time in the war, like the Lewis machine gun or anything else, or a Hotchkiss even for that matter.
Okay. God, it's hard to control this. 1 second. Okay, Jude Steins, fantastic presentation, thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Great talk, Nuala Doyle. Des Dalton, Mahu Aaron, great talk, very interesting. Gaurav Mahagut. Mark Dugan, thanks, Aaron, brilliant presentation. Jude Steins just puts in the US Postal Service were the first major customer for auto ordnance to protect. Sue Tibbles, many thanks. Sorry, I have to leave now. Oh, sorry. Des Dalton says that they came in 25, 50, and 100 round magazines. Tom Feeney, very enjoyable talk. Thanks for your hard work. And Des Dalton just adds that the special branch used them in the 1940s. The IRA, it keeps going up, sorry. The IRA volunteer Jackie Griffith was killed by the special branch firing a Thompson machine gun at him from a passing car in 1943. And just to add, the IRA's usage of him in 1940, Paddy McGrath, I believe, maybe you can correct me, Aaron, but 1940, Paddy McGrath killed 2 special branch officers with a Thompson gun. He was executed for it afterwards, but
he was indeed, but I kicked that one. I kicked that one into touch, and perhaps Jerry Shannon or Des might pick up on that one. It'd be better place to answer that than me.
Can you answer that, lads?
Mm-hmm.
And just write it in the chat box there.
I'm sorry, I just copping that comment there from Robert. Yeah, I can imagine there was a what was, you know, what the hell was that sort of reaction to the sound of to the machine gun. You know, my use of firearms has been rather limited. You know, I've held Thompson submachine guns and others, but insofar as firing ones, rifles and shotguns are the only things that I've fired. So I wouldn't be able to speak to the difference between the sounds of the machine guns, but yeah, you know, I bow to greater knowledge on that if there is a difference between the Thompson submachine gun and the Hotchkiss, that they definitely would be questioning what the what the hell was going on during those ambushes. And as you can imagine, with the exception, I suppose, of Selbridge Hazelhatch, where the land is a lot flatter, you know, all of these stations had large embankments of 20, 30 feet either side of them, which any noise is going to reverberate around and obviously be amplified and increased. So it would be even more frightening, I suppose. And just actually, what I've just remembered there, the actual station itself in Selbridge Hazelhatch does have an embankment, but the attack itself took place outside that. Just for anybody from Kildare there, Des, who might pick me up on that and tell me that there is a railway crossing at Selbridge Hazelhatch, and that it does indeed have an embankment, but the attack itself took place in the flatlands approaching it, rather than the Drumcondra ambushes, Ballyfermot, and Killester, where there's a large embankment either side, and any sort of sound is going to reverberate around that, and indeed within the carriage itself, and also the fact that at the same time that the Thompson guns are being fired, you have rifles, machine guns, and various other incendiaries. I can imagine just this cacophony and noise being extremely disorientating. So yeah, they probably wouldn't have had a Scooby-Doo what the hell was going on. Never mind as to what type of machine gun it was.
Okay. Just on what we mentioned before about 1940, Jerry Shannon puts in pressure is on. IRA volunteers Paddy McGrath and Thomas Hart were executed for the killing of two Gardaí in August 1940. A Thompson machine gun was involved, yes, and found at the scene near Rathgar Road when the men were arrested, where the Gardaí raid took place at the IRA safe house. So I think we're nearly finished up there now. Richard Barnes, good lecture, appreciate your time. Robert, they fire so fast to have a distinct sound. I think it's just sort of a conversation carrying on there now, but here we are again now. John Dorney attacks in 1922. Example, Clonus, February 1922. Ambush of the specialists where there was 14 casualties among the USC. And at Wellington Barracks in November 1922, where there was 18 Free State casualties, where fake bloodiest actions using Thompson in Ireland in that period. I recently read several British Army memoirs from later conflict, often speak of Thompson's used against him by the Provisional IRA in the early 1970s. So it had a long lineage in conflict in Ireland.
Yeah, like I think that's one thing, is that they the Kerry football team travelled over to New York and allegedly smuggled back several of the Hoboken shipment that had been captured in 1921. And as I mentioned earlier, that the guns were smuggled in during the truce period and afterwards, and they popped up throughout the following decades. And as John said there, yeah, they do feature quite a lot in the sort of the British memoirs of the Long War during the 70s and thereafter. You know, arms dumps containing them were discovered throughout the 20s, 40s, 50s, and things like that. I think there was a big discovery in County Mayo, either in the 30s or the 40s, of a dump loaded with Thompson submachine guns, and Tom Barry himself actually was arrested. Tom Barry was arrested for possession of a submachine gun, and during the course of an investigation into the murder of a blue shirt, which he was subsequently cleared of. But when the police came to arrest Tom Barry in connection with this death, he got a Thompson submachine gun just casually chilling underneath the stairs in what we call the cubby hole up here in my part of Dublin. You know, and I kind of love the blasé-ness of that story, that they rock up over to Tom Barry's house, you know, at some period in the early 30s, and there's Tom Barry with just this Thompson submachine gun chilling underneath the stairs, as if it was only a Hoover or I don't know, you know, a bag of coal or something. But yeah, they were some of the ones. If if memory serves me right, some of the Thompson submachine guns that were captured during the Long War were traced back to Bowyer shipments from the truce period or the War of Independence, and they were tracked back by the serial numbers, those that hadn't got them foiled off. And I think I think a lot of the shipment has been accounted for insofar as serial numbers are concerned. As I mentioned earlier, Enniscorthy Castle had one. Kilmainham has at least one, and there's ones there that I've held myself. Ownership, you know. So a lot of them are accounted for, but others, did make it up north during the latter conflict, and were used there to deadly effect. Jesus, I'm just seeing that message there about Maria Maguire. That brings me back. I'd actually looked at Maria Maguire's memoir during my undergrad, but not with regard to the Thompson submachine gun. So that's a great tip I may revisit.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there. Yeah. I'm just reading it here myself.
Geez, I regret not. I had a chance to buy that book a couple of years back that I never took up. I regret not now,
I'll just read it out here for people who are watching on Facebook. We've just got a comment here. Maria Maguire was an IRA volunteer post-1969 who recorded her experiences in the book To Take Arms, A Year in the Provisional IRA, published in 1973, which mentions the old Thompsons resurfacing. She says, most of the weapons were World War II military rifles, such as the M1 carbine, the heavy Garand semi-automatic rifle, it weighs 12 pounds, bolt action Springfields and British Lee Enfields. The rest were assorted pistols of vastly differing types and calibers, plus a few submachine guns, mostly the famous Thompsons. Most IRA men refer to them as the Thompson, although some of the younger ones also call them rattle boxes. They do make an incredible din. Hundreds of them appear to have been smuggled into the country at around that time in 1921, and they rapidly became as much as part of the IRA legend as the trench coat. And Jared Shannon, just after posting a link there for anyone who's on the Zoom, with Paddy McGrath using the Thompson submachine gun. It's actually a great article, Jerry. I was actually reading it the other night. We could finish up here now, and on behalf of Trustness here, I'd like to thank Aaron for joining us again. If anybody wants to watch Aaron's previous talk, he was actually one of our first speakers on Trustness here. You can go back on the YouTube channel and search back. It's a good bit back now, but it's about Ernie O'Malley and the Kilkenny interviews. So this, anyone who's also interested in this talk, it'll be uploaded possibly tonight or tomorrow morning on the Trust in Atira channel on YouTube as well. So on behalf of Trust in Atira, thanks very much, Aaron, for coming on. And of course, we'll get you on again. It's a tradition now to have people on multiple times. So we'll be getting you on. And for everyone else, good night.
Be a Max Lawn in it.